Greetings and welcome. My name is Aaron Craig with Beyond Us Games, and in this tutorial I want to go over how to pause a game in several different ways so you can choose whichever variant you like. So we're going to be using two-dimensional arrays, and since I've been doing my data structures series, I figured this would be a really good place for this video to go. So we're going to use a 2D array, we're going to use a for loop, and we're going to use several properties that I've been discussing to be able to completely pause your game, save every instance exactly where it's at, and then redraw them on the screen at half transparency and display a message to show that your game is obviously paused. And we're going to build this from the ground up, and you'll be able to work with it in any game you want. Now, I'm going to be using my space shooter from my Udemy course. I will provide all of the code we do in this video in scripts for you to download. And if you're interested in my Udemy course, feel free to check it out. Link is below. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. The only thing you're going to need is an object that is persistent and is going to be everywhere in your game. So it needs to be in the beginning, in the end, wherever you want it to be able to be paused, this object has to be there. Now, unfortunately, you're not able to put this in a script because you also need to be drawing some things. So it becomes a little difficult inside of a script. So we're going to be using two events. We're going to be using just a key press, and you can use any key press you want. And then we're going to be using the draw event inside of this object. So with that, let's go ahead and get started by starting out nice and slow. The first thing we're going to look at is how to deactivate things. So I'm going to add a key pressed, go down to others, and this is going to be escape. So we're going to pause the game whenever escape is pressed, and you can use whatever key you want, it doesn't matter. And we're going to go in here, we're going to make a variable called game is paused. We're going to set that equal to false. So we need to have a way to know whether the game is currently running or paused, and this is a good way of doing that. So inside the key pressed, we're going to say if game is paused is equal to false, then we're going to use a function called instance deactivate all. Now inside of this function, we need to say whether this applies to the current calling or not. So we're going to say true because we don't want it to deactivate our system object. If you were to deactivate all objects, including the one who called it, then your game is pretty much done because there's no more objects running any code, so there's really nothing that you can do. So don't do that. And we're going to say else instance activate all. So if the game is paused, then we're going to do that. Now we also need to come in here and set that variable equal to true and false depending on what's pressed. So game is paused is equal to true, and then inside of here we set it equal to false. That way we always know whether the game is paused or not. So if we run this right now, what's going to happen is every single object besides our system object that's running it is going to disappear when I press escape. And then it'll reappear when I press escape again. And everything maintains exactly the way it works. So if you looked at where those ships were, you can press escape, they come back in. So everything is still there, everything is continuing, even the alarms are still going correctly. It's just that everything disappears. So we don't want that, unless that's something you do want. And if you do, then you're pretty much done. It's very simple. You can then draw something on the screen. So if we were to come in here to the draw, we can say while game is paused, have an if statement that says if game is paused, then draw text just anywhere that you want, game is paused. And if that's all you want to do, then you're pretty much done. You may want to draw the text with your views if you're using them, or make sure it's like in the middle, but that will pause your game completely. So that's really simple. Now the one thing that's not paused is the background, because the background is a room and rooms are not deactivated the same way. So if we come into the key press and you want to stop the room, then there's a specific function for that. So we're going to say layer, and depending on what you're doing, my room, so let's open that up, and my rooms have backgrounds that have a horizontal or a vertical speed of 1. So you can have an animation speed if you were to actually have like an animated background, you could have that. That's a property, or you can have just a large background and have it be tiled and scrolling vertically or horizontally. So depending on which background type you're using, you'll use a different function here. So I'm going to type in vSpeed. I'm going to pass in the background layer. So if you type that in exactly the way it is inside of your room, it will work. If you have different names for your backgrounds, you have to get the current name, the current layer ID, and pass that in. So if you have different names, you might want to have an if statement saying, if you're in this room, then the background's called this. That way you can use it in all of the rooms. And we're going to set the speed equal to 0. Now, if you are using H speed, you change the V to H, and you're done. If you're using the speed of like an actual sprite in the background, it's a little more complicated. You just have to say layer background speed, pass in that same thing, and then you pass in the image speed, and the image speed is relative to the speed that you've set. So if I open up my explosion here, you can see that it's 15 frames per second, not frames per game frame. So it's just like image speed that you're adjusting. So make sure that if you adjust that, you adjust it appropriately. That way it works the way you want it to. So you would just set those if you have those. I don't, so we're not going to worry about them. So I'm going to copy this and paste this right here and set this back equal to 1. Now I can set that equal to 1 myself because that's what it starts at. I know that. I'm not going to be changing it. If your background speed changed depending on maybe music or where the character's at inside of the level, you'll probably have a variable inside of here that said like background speed, and then you would set that equal to 0 when it's here, and maybe you'd keep like a original background variable around here so you can set that back inside of there. But I don't need to worry about that. It's always going to be 1. So now if we run that, we'll be able to pause even the background. So it looks like everything is completely paused now, which is great. Okay, that's exactly what we want for that. But I want to do more. I want all of the instances that are in the level to still look like they're there, but just look like they're paused. Now this becomes a lot trickier because if I actually come in here and put a breakpoint and press F6, you can look inside of the debugger and see that there are no more objects inside of the game itself. So I'm going to turn this on, pull that up, and you can look, if I press new game, you can look and see that there are tons of objects appearing. But if I press escape, then I can run through that, and now all of a sudden there are there's no objects except object system, that's it. Everything else is gone. So if we open this up again and I press escape, they come back. So when you deactivate an object, it's completely gone. It's just not in the scope of the game anymore. GameMaker Studio still knows where it's at and it knows how to activate them, but you can't access deactivated objects. So what that means is if we want to store their properties, we need to do it before this line gets called. So let's go ahead and do that. What we're going to need is a variable inside of here. We're going to call this all objects, and this needs to be a 2D array. So I'm going to set it up just as a 0, 0, and put that equal to no one at first. That way, if for some reason your objects don't get stored properly and you try and draw it, it's going to come up with an error the very first time you do that. So inside of here, we're going to have a for loop. So we're going to put for, and now an important thing that I haven't been doing but I was corrected on is we should be using the term var right here, which is for variable, but it stands for a local variable. So var I is equal to 0. Now the reason we do this is that I will then never come up outside of this for loop. If you were to use something besides just I, like if you were to ever use I anywhere else, at the end of the for loop, that variable would still be there if you don't set it to be local. Outside of this for loop now, this I will never exist again. So we can use it confidently and assuredly without worry about that. So var I equal to 0. Now I is going to continue while it's less than instance count. This is a built-in property that GameMaker has that will store how many instances of any kind are inside of your room at any time. It does not count deactivated objects, which is why it will work for us. So we do while it's less than instance count, and we're going to increase I. And you can see that I turns yellow everywhere we use it because it's a local variable. So if I tried to access it outside of here, it's not going to work because it doesn't actually exist outside of this for loop. Okay, now what we're going to do inside of here is actually capture all of the objects that are running in the game. And to do that, we're going to start with I right there and 0 right there. We're going to capture all of the properties of a sprite. And the way we do that is by using the function instance find, which if we click on this, it's actually a function that will find all of the kinds of objects that are related to the one you put in there, starting at 0 going up to how many there are. So this is a very useful function, and you can use it with parents and inheritance. So if you wanted to just find out how many enemies there are and you had an enemy parent, you could pass in the enemy parent, and then you could gather every single enemy, just like this for loop does down here. You could find every single enemy, and then you would be all set to do something with them, like slow them down, increase their damage, whatever it wanted to be. This is a very great function. And we can also use it with the keyword all. So we are going to find every single kind of object. So it's going to list all of them, and we're going to start with I, and it's going to go all the way to the end. So right here, this is actually capturing an object. This function returns an object in the game, which means that we can use the accessor, the dot right here, to get the property of that object. And the property we want, first off, will be sprite index. Now, why do I want the sprite index? Why do I want to capture all this? Remember, once we call this line of code, all of the objects are gone, so we can't save, we can't do anything with the objects that we want to draw on the screen because they're no longer there. But with a 2D array, if we store all of the information about that sprite that the object currently has associated with it, we can redraw it on the screen perfectly the way it was. Well, what are all the properties of a sprite? That's actually really easy to find out. You can do draw sprite ext. And if we open that up, we can come in and see these are all of the arguments that you need to draw this, to use this function, because this is all of the properties of a sprite that you can manipulate in the code. So you've got the sprite, the subimage, x, y, x scale, y scale, rotation, color, and alpha. Now, you have speed, and there's a few more that you can alter through code, but for drawing a static image on the screen, these are all of the things you need to capture so that it always looks the same way that it was. Now we're going to capture all of these in exactly this order because then it makes drawing them really easy on the screen. So let's go ahead and delete that part. And what I'm going to do is actually copy this, and I'm going to copy this 7 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I'm going to change these to be correct. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Now, that means that while this is 0, so it finds the first object, it's going to capture all of the properties of that once we assign it the ones correctly to capture. So we don't want to capture the sprite index 8 times. That would be dumb. Instead, we want to capture the image index. And I'm looking off screen here so I know exactly which ones we need. I don't actually have these memorized. So we're going to capture x, y, image, x scale, copy that, and then image y scale. And then we have image angle, image blend, and image alpha. Okay, that gives us everything there. So let's run this with the debugger, and we can actually watch it start capturing all of the objects in the game, which is really neat. Okay, so I'm going to turn on debugging up here, or global, and we can see all the instances here. Now, if I run this, now I think what's going to happen, okay, so we'll get the first one. So I'm going to press escape, and this is going to come up, and we can look at this all objects actually being built, which is really cool. So the first one right now is no one, which is -4. So we're going to run through this. So the first one is going to be 0, and that means that the first sprite is 0, so that's our ship. So it's actually going to capture all of the instances, basically the way that this list is right there. So we keep going. It finds the image index, which is 0.5. The X coordinate, the Y, goes on and so forth, all the way through. And then I gets increased. And now we're going to run into an error. It captures the player ship first, but then it's going to come into OBJ system. And if I let this run one more time, we can see here that this is now a 2D array, which is really neat. Now you've got the sprite index, which is -1. -1 is not a valid sprite index. Now we can capture it like this, and if I just press F9 right here and take that off and press play, we can see here that I can continue it and it pauses correctly. And if we come in here, we can look at OBJ system and look at that all objects array, and it has 32 objects inside of here, and you can look at every single one to see what it is. Now, here is the problem. We have captured a sprite that doesn't exist because OBJ system has no sprite attached to it. Currently, that's not a problem. But as soon as we try to go in and actually draw that sprite, it will become a problem. If you try to draw a sprite that doesn't exist, you're going to get an error. So if we come down here, I'm going to show you that error, and then I'm going to show you how to fix that. So right now we're drawing the text. So we're going to put another for loop inside of here. I'm going to say for var I is equal to 0. And again, you want to use local variables. Put I is less than array height 2D. We've talked about that in our second part of our array tutorial. So we know we want to pass in all objects, and we'll get back exactly what we need. We're going to increase I. Now we're going to draw pretty much everything that we've captured. We're going to do that with draw sprite ext. Now, the awesome part is that we've captured them in exactly the correct order. So if I type all objects I0, then I can just copy this 7 times and change this second number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Make sure you have commas in there, otherwise you will run into problems. And I normally like to have spaces. And in case you didn't know, you can put these on different lines. GameMaker doesn't care. It's going to look at this all as one line. So let's change these to 1 through 8. And then let's run it and look at the error we get, so that if you ever run into it again, if you try to code this in another game and you run into that, then you'll know why you're getting run into that. Okay, so I'm going to press F5. No debugger this time. I'm just going to run it. And I can press it on this first screen, and we'll get that error because it has OBJ system in here. So it says trying to draw non-existing sprite. And it tells you where it is, and it tells you which line it's on. So it's trying to draw a non-existing sprite because we've captured a non-existing sprite. I've showed you that in the debugger, and hopefully that makes sense. So OBJ system here, it doesn't have a sprite attached to it. It returns -1. So if we know that, if all of the system objects are going to return -1 for the sprite, we can use that information to then just not capture it. So inside of here, inside of our key press, I'm going to put an if statement. And it's going to say if instance find all I dot sprite index. So I'm going to check this sprite, the first object found, or the object found with I currently. And we're going to say if it doesn't equal -1, then go ahead and capture it. Then we want to go ahead and put it inside of our array. That makes sense. We find the ones that have -1 attached to it, and then we just don't put it inside of our array. So now if we run this, it's not going to work just yet. It may work in some circumstances, like if I were to run it right now on this screen, it would work. But then if I came inside of here and ran it, I'm going to get a push execution error. Now, the reason for this is that we are skipping over system objects that don't have sprites. But we have an array that is still being built, and then when we go to draw it, this doesn't know that we've skipped over anything. So it gets to the second or third entry, and there's nothing there, because maybe that second or third entry was a system object, and we didn't save anything, we just increased I. And now all of a sudden, if we say 3-0, there's just nothing there. So you get an error because it can't do anything with nothing. So there's two ways you can fix that. You can come in and say, I want to change it in here. I just want to make sure my array only has objects that can be drawn. Or you can come into the draw and say, I want to check all of the objects in the array as I'm drawing them for valid values. What I'm going to do is change it inside of here. I'm going to make it so that our array only has valid values to be drawn, so we don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to put a variable inside of here. It's going to be a local variable. It's going to be called offset, and it's going to be equal to 0. And now offset is going to be what we use to make sure our array from 0 to the end is only filled with correct values. So we have an if statement right here, and we only capture it when it's non-system objects. So what I want to do when it's a system object is actually increase offset by 1. And then inside of here, I'm going to subtract the value of I by offset. So until we haven't skipped anything, this isn't going to do anything. But as soon as we skip that first system object, this is going to then decrease the actual array that we are putting it into by 1. So that 1 through n, however many entries we have, will always be valid. So I'm going to copy this and paste it into every single one. And now, if I run this, we can come in here and see that we can completely pause the game. All of the objects are there. And we can pause the game here, and all of the objects stay there. Now you may notice a couple of things disappear, and that would be things that are being drawn on the screen. If you want to keep those, you're going to require a lot more effort and forethought, because when system objects are deactivated, they stop drawing to the screen. So if you want to keep all of the drawing on the screen, then you need to put this code, or specifically activate the object that is drawing to the screen when you deactivate everything else. So if you have one object that draws everything to the screen and that's all it does, that'll probably work just fine. But if you have drawing inside of your OBJ player ship and it's getting deactivated, well, you can't keep that activated to keep the drawing on the screen, because then you could keep playing the game. So that gets a little more complicated, but basically you just have to have one object drawing to the screen and keep that object alive as well. You do that with a specific function just called instance activate. And you can activate object right there, and you can specify the object. So if you had OBJ drawing, you just keep that alive, and everything will still be drawn to the screen, which is perfectly fine. Now let's get everything to draw at half transparency. So let's go into the draw event. The way to do that is actually right here. We're going to say the transparency is going to be drawn at divided by 2. So we can come into the game, and now we can pause it, and everything looks like it's still there. So it says the game is paused, but it's not actually playing anymore. So if you come in, everything is frozen exactly where it's at, and we've stored all of the sprite properties in there that we want, which is really cool. And if you wanted to, you could also store object properties and then apply those after the game is unpaused, and so on and so forth. There's a lot you can do, but this is the basis for pausing a game. It works pretty much anywhere. The last thing we want to do for safety, because there is one thing that can go wrong with this system. Because we're building an array, if you are in a room with a lot of objects and you pause the game, you have an array of size 30 to 100 to 1,000. And then if you go into a room with 3 objects and you press escape, it's going to draw everything in that array, even the things that aren't in that room anymore. So when we go else, we want to say all objects equals 0. And we don't want to put this in an array form, this will actually completely reset it. So now, if I add in an event, key pressed, let's go to others, backspace, and I said room, go to room, main menu, we can pause the game with all the ships, go to the main menu, and see that it is still going to work properly and not draw a bunch of extra things. So I paused it, created the array, come in here, didn't do that. If we did not have this inside of here, then what it would look like is drawing a bunch of objects that were in the array when it was originally paused and not in there now. So I pause that, press escape, you can see that they're all inside of there. So that's like a safety guard. If you go from a large room to a small room, this will reset that array, which is very important. So that's what I've got for you. Hopefully you're able to follow along. I know it's kind of a long tutorial, but it's also a great system that you can use in all of your games and just take it from one to another because it will work everywhere you are. And it's very flexible, so if you want to make something a little bit different, hopefully you understand exactly how it works so you can tweak it to your liking. If you have any questions about it, if it didn't make any sense, please sound off below. I'll do my best to answer you and help as much as I can. That's what I've got for you today, though. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, have fun making great games, and I will talk to you later.